Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a legal system that has survived for literally millennia. And the secret to its survival, it didn't stand as a rigid, unyielding wall. No, it flowed and adapted just like a river. We're going to trace the ancient sources of Hindu law, tracking exactly how it evolved from deep spiritual wisdom into a highly structured, practical system of jurisprudence. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the roots of Hindu law, move up to Sruti, the divine herd, then down to Smrti, the practical codes. After that, we'll dive into custom and inner conscience, and finally wrap up with its evolution to the modern era. Let's get to it. All right, Section 1, the roots of Hindu law. Take a look at these foundational notes. They perfectly map out how the timeline splits into older days, the Vedas, Smriti, the commentaries, and customs, and how those ancient elements actually flow right into modern legislations and precedents. It's a continuous, constantly evolving system. Really cool, right? Now, you have to remember, in the ancient world, law wasn't just isolated in some boring, sterile courtroom. It was a core part of this massive, all-encompassing concept called dharma. Dharma basically wove your religious and social duties right alongside your personal moral compass and your legal obligations. It was literally the whole fabric of how you lived your life. Moving on to Section 2, Sruti, which means the divine herd. So the word Sruti literally translates to that which is heard. It comes from the word Veda, which originates from vid, simply meaning to know. What we're talking about here is an incredible oral tradition of divine revelation. We're talking way back, from 4000 to 1000 BC. These were the absolute, supreme, authoritative texts. And these 4 distinct Vedas, they each had a super specific job. You've got the Rig Veda, which is massive, over 1,000 hymns. Then the Yajur Veda, which details the exact processes for sacrifices. The Sama Veda gives us the chants used with soma plant juice. And then there's the Atharva Veda, which takes a totally different turn. It's packed with spells, charms, and even exorcisms. Wild stuff. But here's the really interesting part. As abstract and intensely ritualistic as these Vedas were, they actually held the earliest seeds of practical law. They touched on totally relatable, everyday things you and I know: marriage, adoption, dividing up property, inheritance, and even Stridban, which specifically secured women's property rights back then. Now we start moving down the waterfall. Think of it this way. You have the pure divine Shruti, the abstract ultimate truth that was divinely heard. Then you transition to Smriti. Smriti means that which is recollected. This was a huge shift. It took all that divine theory and turned it into human application, practical codes that actually bridge the gap to daily life. Which brings us to Section 3, Smriti, the practical codes. Check out this timeline. It perfectly traces how human codification picked up steam. Between 800 and 200 BC, we have the early Dharma Sutras, basically just prose to explain the Vedas to students. But right around 200 BC, boom, we hit a massive milestone, the Monu Smrti, the oldest and most famous of these codes. Then fast forward a bit to the 2nd century AD, and the Yajnavalkya Smrti shows us a legal system that is getting incredibly sophisticated. You can see from these original source notes how the Smriti evolved into a much more structured system. They basically categorize society into 3 distinct buckets: achara for your daily conduct, vyavahara focusing specifically on legal procedures, and prayaschitta for handling things like penance and expiation. And honestly, it's fascinating how grounded the 200 BC Manu's Smrti actually is. I mean, these ancient jurists weren't just sitting around debating high-level philosophy. They were in the weeds dealing with the exact same mundane issues we handle right now: debt, pledges, theft, deposits, wages, business partnerships, and robbery. Really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? So the system just keeps adapting and maturing. By the 2nd century AD, the Yajnavalkya Smrti is laying out specific court procedures and even ordeals. And get this. Here is a completely revolutionary idea for the ancient world. It explicitly declared that the king is subordinate to the law. Yep, the king only holds the power of danda, symbolized by the sengol or scepter, purely to enforce justice, absolutely not to stand above it. But all of this rigorous text and codification brings up a pretty unavoidable problem. What on earth happens when these ancient texts are completely silent on a hyperlocal issue? Or some totally brand new dispute pops up. Where do you turn then? Well, that's exactly what Section 4 covers: custom and inner conscience. This is where the ancient system's incredible flexibility really shines. They officially recognized achara, customary practice, as the living law. If a custom was well established and long standing in a community, it basically had the force of law. And if even custom fell short, they relied on atmatrupti, which is the inner moral conscience of a righteous person. They literally built individual ethics right into the legal framework. How amazing is that? Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Evolution to the Modern Era. Okay, so as centuries passed, obviously the law needed some updating. Scholars started writing these vast commentaries to interpret the old Smrtis for their own more modern times. We see the foundational texts branching out into huge, famous commentaries. Think along the lines of Vijayaneshwara's Mitakshara or Jamutavahana's Dayabhara. Then a massive shift happened. When the British arrived, colonial administrators like Warren Hastings realized pretty quickly they couldn't just ignore this massive, living body of local law. But they needed it formalized. So Hastings gathered 10 Hindu pundits to compile all this existing wisdom into a text called the Vivada Arnava Setu, which was then translated into English as the Hindu Gentle Code. This whole British codification chain just kept rolling with Governor Cornwallis and Sir William Jones. They relied super heavily on local brilliance, tasking scholars like Jagannatha Tarkapanchana to compile new digests, which were then translated by people like Colebrook. Now, this was a pivotal moment. It was the exact moment a beautifully fluid tradition was poured into a much more rigid colonial mold so the British courts could easily digest it. Yet, despite that rigid codification, the ancient stream still flows right into our present day. Modern elements like contemporary legislation and judicial precedents, they are still heavily guided by those age-old principles of justice, equity, and good conscience. Even in India today, courts frequently reference concepts like dharma and customary practice to figure out how to interpret the law. So, the absolute biggest takeaway from this explainer is why ancient Hindu law survived in the first place. It was never, ever meant to be a static, rigid wall. It's a dynamic, living stream that successfully connected the most abstract divine wisdom all the way down to the messy, everyday practical needs of human beings, evolving at every single step. I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought. If a legal system that finds its deepest roots in 4000 BC was designed to be so adaptable that it could flex to local community custom and even a person's inner conscience, well, how flexible should our modern laws be today? Knowing how beautifully this ancient stream adapted to real human realities, does it change the way you view the rigidity of our modern justice system? Think about that and keep exploring.